Welcome to Defining Dad Bod, where we work to untangle the messy knots of the health and fitness industry as if your children's lives depended on it. Because they do. This is where we decide to make our bodies stand for something bigger than ourselves. This is where we find practical wisdom to live by, one powerful conversation at a time. May the words spoken here inspire you to keep moving forward no matter where you are. Who knows who you could be if you could become 1% better every single day.
We can do the show thanks to the support of listeners just like you. For more information how you can become part of the inner circle, go to findingdadbod.com/inner circle.
What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing super well. Today's show is going to be a powerful show. We're going to be talking through carbohydrates. This is a special episode in this series, TRUFIT 2020, Achieving Long-Term Health and Fitness Goals, because an intelligent and scientifically backed outlook on carbohydrates is going to be an important part of you achieving and sustaining awesome health and fitness goals. This particular episode is jam-packed with so much information that I had to divide it into two pieces. In our first section here, we'll be talking through the science of carbohydrates and what differentiates them from fats and proteins. And then we'll take an educated look at what role carbohydrates actually play in the body. And spoiler alert, we'll be going beyond mere energy metabolism in terms of carbs and fats to talk specifically about things like digestive health, gut microbiome, and neurotransmitters in the brain. And then next week, we'll be talking about why carbs get a bad rap, both from a psychological perspective and a biological perspective. And then we'll talk about how we use carbohydrates in our programming here at Defining Dad Bod. And then we'll be talking through some practical tips on how you can regulate carbohydrates in an intelligent way that adds to your quality and quantity of life. Before we get there, I want to highlight one of the awesome reviews that popped up on iTunes this week. Jay Hartzell Jr. says, 1 in a million. 5 stars. I've listened to a lot of different podcasts talking about nutrition and fitness, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I try to take knowledge from all of them. Some are absolute garbage. The podcast that Alex puts out is the most comprehensive information I have found out of all of them. Pure facts, not some hyped up crap. Whether it's nutrition or fitness, he covers the science of it all. Give it a listen. And if you have questions, ask him. Pure gold. Wow, brother, thank you for that awesome review, and a sincere thank you to the supporters of the show who keep us unbought and unbiased so that we can put out some awesome stuff. With my 14 years in the health and fitness industry, and the science of food, exercise, and lifestyle changing so rapidly, I know it's very, very difficult for the average person to keep up with what the heck you should think about what you should eat, how you should exercise, and different ways you might get more out of yourself, depending on the habits of your own life. So it really is my honor to make that sort of thing accessible and available to you on this show. And the people who keep us on air make that possible. If you're not one of those people yet and you would like to be, go to definingdadbod.com/donate. And if you want to see what all the fuss is about, you should check out definingdadbod.com/inner circle. And there you'll have an opportunity to connect with our tribe, as well as getting attached to the resources of Defining Dad Bod that, thanks to our generous supporters, are free to you. That's definingdadbod.com/donate to support the show, and definingdadbod.com/inner circle to join the group. All right. Enough show business. Let's dive into the science of carbohydrates and what they're actually doing in your body. Carbohydrates. Probably one of the most hotly contested macronutrients out there. And I mean, there's only 3 of them: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, so that's not exactly claiming a gold star victory. But chances are, no matter what you do for a living, no matter how often you exercise, no matter what you're doing from a diet perspective, you've had a run-in with the word carbohydrates. And today, my goal is to help you understand what a carbohydrate actually is, what its properties are, what it might do for your body in a positive way, what it could do in a negative way, and then I hope to tie up the conversation by explaining a little bit about how I coach carbohydrates with my clients who have body composition, performance, or health goals. Since this is a hotly contested topic worth hours and hours and hours of research, evaluation, and conversation, I plan to keep this conversation informative and practical, but I want you to know that it's by no means exhaustive. I'll be referencing other episodes of Defining Dad Bod here as well, since I have covered several of these topics related to carbohydrates, just in a different place. You'll find those links in the show notes below. Before we get to what they do in the body, or even how we handle them in programming since they have such a bad rap among most people, let's talk about what carbohydrates actually are. Carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients. As I mentioned earlier, there are fats, also known as lipids. There are proteins, which are long chains of amino acids tied together. And then there are carbohydrates. There are many classes of carbohydrates, specifically polysaccharides, disaccharides, and monosaccharides. And if you're a chemistry geek like I am, you can go look those up and see how those molecules all fit together and what makes them different from fatty acids, which make up fats, and amino acids, which make up proteins. What makes carbohydrates one of the most interesting points of contention, however, is actually a relatively easy property to understand that's tied up in the molecule. Now I say it's an easy property to understand, but I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway if you don't understand it yet, because I studied organic chemistry for several years, and I've been in the personal training industry for a while, and it wasn't until about 10 years into my career that I understood molecularly what differentiated carbohydrates from fats, that they might affect our body differently. In order to understand this, though, I've got to take you back to 6th grade or 7th grade biology. Remember when you were learning about the cell? That was the basic building block of life, right? And the cell was wrapped in what's called a lipid bilayer, or a membrane, and inside of the cell were organelles, a bunch of different pieces of machinery that let the cell operate appropriately. You might remember words like endoplasmic reticulum, nucleus, or lysosome. One particular organelle is extremely important among all of the others, because its job is to supply the cell with the energy required to power the cell to do life-enhancing and life-propagating things. That organelle is called your mitochondria. You might have heard it called the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria's job is to take raw materials and then, through a complex set of chemical reactions across the membrane of the mitochondria, to synthesize what we call ATP. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the molecule in your body that stores the energy that you use to power all of the chemical reactions that happen in your body. On this show specifically, we've talked about things like epigenetics, which is the turning on of certain genetic alleles to bring about changes at the level of the cell. The turning on, quote-unquote, of genes requires ATP to power that activity. On this show also, we've talked about exercise, which is consciously and intentionally putting your body through strenuous motions in order to create cellular adaptations. When you do a bicep curl and your muscle tissue shortens with actin-myosin filaments interacting with each other, that reaction is also powered by ATP. And if I haven't lost you yet with all this science speak, the neurons that are firing in your brain to try to remember this and try to make sense of what I'm saying to you is also powered by ATP. So you see, all of the energy and activity of your life centers around the function of the mitochondria in every single one of your cells. Now, what in the world does this have to do with carbohydrates, Alex? One more piece of information you need to understand, and I'll stop throwing science at you hard and fast, is that mitochondria create ATP by using oxygen to coax electrons to move very fast over the membrane of the organelle. Without oxygen, the mitochondria cannot produce ATP because there's nothing forcing the electrons to move across the membrane of the organelle. I'll relate this to a real-life example. Over Christmas, Gabriel got a remote control excavator from his grandpa. Ironically, it's actually really hard to drive that thing well, and it took me a while to figure the controls out. But just like anything that takes batteries, when we opened the box, we had to go get a screwdriver and open up the battery panel. It took some double A's, and I showed Gabriel how to match up the plus side and the minus side, and explained to him that the excavator would not turn on unless we had these lined up right. "Why is that, Dad?" he asked. Then I explained to him that the battery was storing an amazing amount of an energy molecule called an electron, and the electron is what made his little remote control excavator work. But if the electron did not shoot across the excavator in the right direction, then the excavator would not be able to turn on. So it's very important that we put the battery in the right position so that the one side of the battery can suck the electrons from the other side of the battery all the way through the excavator. Now, if you're a physicist or chemist listening to this, you're probably pulling your hair out right now. I understand that was a very simple explanation of electronegativity. But many people don't know that just like the battery in the excavator, the same thing is happening at the level of the mitochondria in your cell. And oxygen is the molecule that drives the electron action potential across the mitochondria to create ATP. If you don't take anything else away from what I just said, hear this. Without oxygen, you cannot create adenosine triphosphate. Without adenosine triphosphate, no reactions happen in the body. Thanks for the biology lesson. I appreciate it. Now I can go help my middle schooler with his homework, Alex. But what the heck does this have to do with carbohydrates? And now we come to the rub. Well, carbohydrates and fats differ in the body in a bunch of different ways. The primary difference between the energy that comes from carbohydrates and the energy that comes from fats is that fats have no oxygen in the molecule itself. It requires that your body breathes in oxygen, then translates that oxygen into the bloodstream, then pumps that oxygen throughout the body, and then transfuses that oxygen from the bloodstream to the individual cells where they can be used at the level of the mitochondria to create ATP. Carbs, on the other hand, have oxygen built into the molecule. Where fats require your body to provide the oxygen, carbohydrates can make it all the way to the cell, all the way down to the mitochondria, and power the reaction all by themselves, without requiring the body to move oxygen there first. And for this reason, every individual human being has an attribute that we've called in the scientific community metabolic flexibility. That is the ability to use carbohydrates or fats and to switch between them when the situation requires them. In sports science, we call this the different energy systems. You've probably heard that a marathon runner uses primarily fats as a fuel source, or requiring carbohydrates just to keep the blood sugar stable, whereas a 400-meter sprinter uses almost exclusively carbohydrates and creatine phosphate in order to complete their activity. One activity is a long-duration sport, requiring the body to move lots of oxygen to the cells to make good use of the efficiency of using fat as a fuel source, whereas the other activity is a short-duration activity. The cells in the body are able to just use the carbohydrate stores that are available to churn out that level of work at a very high intensity, because it's not limited by how much oxygen is able to get to the cells. So ideally, every human body would be capable of smoothly transitioning between the usage of fat as a fuel source and carbohydrates as a fuel source, depending on the demand of the situation. We'll talk about this more later, but the vast majority of people who come to work with me for body composition goals specifically actually have to start in the phases of training that reteach their body how to use fat as a fuel source. This lack of metabolic inflexibility comes from a mixture of poor eating habits, coupled with some genetic factors, and a lack of exercise in the presence of excessive carbohydrate consumption. In short, you don't need short-term fuel stores if you're not doing anything intense on a regular basis. And so if you're eating carbohydrates all the time and not exercising regularly, then your body can easily become lazy with the whole fat burn thing and become more and more conditioned to relying on carbohydrates while sparing your fat stores. More on that later when we talk about how we periodize carbohydrates. For now, a recap so far. Carbohydrates are one of the 3 macronutrients, and carbs and fats are utilized at the level of the mitochondria in order to create the energy that you run on, living a high-quantity, high-quality life. Carbs are easier for the body to use for energy because they have an oxygen molecule built right into them. And overconsumption of carbohydrates, especially in the presence of certain genetic factors, poor lifestyle habits, and lack of exercise, can cause the body to become adapted to relying on carbohydrates and sparing fat rather than using it. So now we have a handle on what carbohydrates actually are and why they're different from fats. Let's talk about how they might interact with the body outside of simple energy production. In addition to being an important short-term energy source that provides oxygen within every molecule of a carbohydrate, carbohydrates also affect the digestive system. When you eat carbohydrates, they begin breaking down as soon as you start chewing them. There are several enzymes in your saliva. One of them specifically is called amylase. In the process of chewing and mixing your carbohydrate with saliva begins the breakdown process of carbohydrates. Ultimately, your larger carbohydrates, polysaccharides and disaccharides, are broken down into single individual pieces called monosaccharides. And those monosaccharides are either transported directly into the bloodstream or they're metabolized by some of the bugs in your gut and other enzymes later on. The 2 primary monosaccharides that your body uses in order to create the energy we were talking about earlier are glucose and fructose. And most digestible carbohydrates are made up of those in a long chain fashion that until each link of the chain is broken, they can't make it to the bloodstream. So again, that process as you start to chew your oatmeal as an example begins in your mouth, then slides down your esophagus to your stomach. Harsher enzymes and hydrochloric acid continue the process, and most of the carbohydrates that you eat are broken down and then transported into the bloodstream from the stomach right there. Once carbohydrates are in the bloodstream, they've taken the form of glucose. And at this point, we measure this glucose in terms of blood sugar. After eating carbohydrates, they break down in your mouth all the way to the stomach, and then your blood sugar starts to rise as a result. We'll talk more about blood sugar in just a second, but you should also note that there are other carbohydrates in your food that don't get transported into the bloodstream at the level of the stomach. Instead, they continue on through the digestive system, either because they're resistant to your enzymes, or because the chains of carbohydrates are so long that they don't have time to fully break down in the stomach before they move on. Now, these carbohydrates are generally referred to as fibers or starches. And what's really powerful about these is that once they make it out of the stomach and even the small intestine, they can be used to feed bacterial colonies in your body and your large intestine. So the fiber and the starches promote proper motility, meaning the speed of the food passing through the system, and certain carbohydrates can make it all the way to the gut flora of your body, and there they can feed or promote positive bacterial colonies while also feeding the lining of the digestive system. One study I read recently while battling a potential colitis flare-up was about resistant starches. Those resistant starches are starches that make it all the way to our large intestine, but can still be broken down by the bacterial colonies there. 3 sources I found to be particularly interesting were green bananas. That is, bananas before they've gotten the opportunity to ripen, which is why green bananas taste less like sugar than a very ripe banana. It's an acquired taste, but those starches might make it all the way to your large intestine and feed some great bacteria for you. Also, cold white rice, the real stuff, not the processed stuff that's been boiled for hours and hours and hours, the stuff that takes a little while to cook, and cold cooked potatoes can also be a source of resistant starch. After you've cooked your rice or after you've cooked your potatoes, you refrigerate those, and the starch molecules that have been broken apart actually reform together upon refrigeration and make a longer chain starch that will make it all the way to your large intestine as well. We can talk more about that on another day if you're interested, but for now just know that even before carbohydrates make it to the level of your cell, they act on your digestive system by regulating motility, that is the speed your food moves through your system, by feeding bacterial colonies, and by providing energy to the lining of the digestive system so that it can repair itself. Another function carbohydrates have on the body that not many people talk about with regard to carbs and fats is that carbohydrates can also create changes in neurotransmitters in the brain. We're not really sure of the mechanism entirely. It might be the rising blood sugar, it might be signals sent from the small and large intestine, specifically the bacterial colonies that make it all the way to our brain, or it might simply be tasting carbohydrates that does it itself. But carbohydrates seem to have an effect specifically on serotonin and dopamine in the brain, and thus actually might play a role in self-regulating mood with food. And you know this to be true. Think about it. When you're really stressed at work, or you've had a really long day, are you hankering for an avocado, or do blueberry muffins become irresistible? Or when you're on a really long drive, and you're going to be in a car for a while, and you want to pick me up, you don't feel like snacking on spinach leaves, do you? You want chips, candy, or even a sugary energy drink. Regulating these neurotransmitters is extremely important to your body, and your brain's not stupid. One of the fastest fixes when serotonin and dopamine take a plunge and make you feel a little garbagey is to reach for a comfort food. Salty, sweet, crunchy. Your mind has associated those textures and those tastes with something that's very capable of boosting your mood. A fun side note, serotonin as a neurotransmitter seems to be directly related to the status of ourselves within our community. They've done studies at weddings, for instance, to check the serotonin levels of the couple that's getting married and the family members and guests present. Serotonin rises among all people attending the wedding, but the serotonin rises highest in the bride and groom and in the parents of the bride and groom. Presumably, the ceremony itself, at least for a brief period, elevates the status of the bride and groom and their respective families in their community. Notably, we tend to like to eat cake at weddings, which would further elevate the serotonin level in both the wedding party and the guests. And similar findings have been found with birthday parties as well. Imagine the strangeness of a world where for your birthday, instead of giving cake to everybody to share the serotonin, you fed everybody a salad. I'm not saying we should do that, but the absurdity of that helps you understand to what level we have used carbohydrates to regulate our mood and even our status and the status of our guests through dopamine and serotonin. It's just not quite a party without cake, now is it? Now we've said a lot of things so far, so let's make sure we're all tracking. Carbohydrates are a short-term fuel source because of the oxygen that each molecule of carbohydrates carries with it to the level of the cell. Carbohydrates can also influence our digestive system, both through resistant starches and fiber, to influence how things work and recover around there. And carbohydrates can also influence our brain, specifically as seen in the cases of serotonin and dopamine, and thus can easily become what we call comfort foods, used to regulate mood, rather than to fuel the body or aid digestion. Now that we've got a good handle on what carbohydrates actually are and how they act on the body, then we're ready to dive into our subject matter next week when we talk about why carbs get a bad rap in the fitness industry, specifically with regard to weight loss, and then how I use carbohydrates in coaching my clients to promote long-term health and fitness change that maximize quality and quantity of life. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. This has been Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names. The free, practical advice and conversations here remain unbought and unbiased thanks to the support of listeners just like you. If this episode's been helpful to you, please share it with somebody in your life who you know it will benefit. Then, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a raving review to tell others what value Defining Dad Bod has brought to your health and fitness journey. And finally, if you want more Defining Dad Bod, consider joining our online community. We send a lot of free perks and resources your way, and I, Coach Alex, go live every month to talk through our listeners' health and fitness questions to make the practical science of this show applicable to everyday life. Everyone's welcome, and we'd love to have you. For more information about joining the Inner Circle or becoming a supporter of the Defining Dad Bod podcast, go to definingdadbod.com/inner circle. That's definingdadbod.com/inner circle.